Dawn arrives slowly over the city of Rome. A thin veil of morning mist hangs above the Tiber River, drifting between stone bridges and temple columns. As the first sounds of the day begin to stir, bakers feed wood into their ovens. Vendors drag wooden carts over worn paving stones. Somewhere in the distance, a mule brays against the quiet. It is the year 150 AD. At the height of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome is the beating heart of a world that stretches farther than most of its inhabitants will ever imagine. From the misty forests beyond the Rhine River to the burning deserts of Syria, from the storm-lashed cliffs of Britannia to the fertile valleys of the Nile River, tens of millions live under the authority of a single imperial system. On maps carved into marble, it looks like a triumph of order and permanence. But survival within this vast empire is never guaranteed. For the ordinary Roman, whether citizen, freedman, slave, or provincial farmer, life is a daily negotiation with uncertainty. The empire promises roads, laws, aqueducts, and grain. Yet behind these monumental achievements lies a fragile human reality. Hunger, disease, political upheaval, and sudden violence remain constant companions. To live in the Roman world is to exist inside a system both magnificent and unforgiving. Nowhere is this contradiction more visible than in Rome itself. Nearly 1 million people crowd into the capital, making it the largest city the world has ever known. They arrive from every corner of the empire: merchants from Alexandria, soldiers from Gaul, sailors from Carthage, and laborers from the rugged hills of Hispania. They live packed together in towering apartment blocks known as insulae, structures of wood, brick, and hope stacked precariously above narrow streets. A wealthy Roman senator may sleep beneath painted ceilings and marble columns, but most inhabitants of the city climb 5 or 6 floors of unstable staircases to reach a single cramped room. Fire is always a threat, so is collapse, and yet the city never stops growing. Every day, tens of thousands gather in markets and forums where grain shipments from distant provinces determine whether bread will remain plentiful or vanish by nightfall. Rome does not feed itself. Its survival depends on a vast logistical network stretching across the Mediterranean Sea. Ships laden with wheat sail from Egypt and North Africa, guided by winds that are never entirely predictable. If storms destroy the harvest, or pirates disrupt the supply routes, the consequences ripple through the capital with frightening speed. An empty granary can become a riot by sunset. The empire's rulers understand this danger well. In the imperial palace overlooking the Palatine Hill, the emperor governs not only armies and provinces, but the delicate balance that keeps Rome alive. Roads must remain secure. Governors must remain loyal. Harvests must arrive on time. Stability in the Roman world is not a permanent condition. It is something constantly maintained. Beyond the capital, survival takes on different forms. Farmers struggle against unpredictable weather. Frontier soldiers endure brutal winters and sudden raids. Traders gamble fortunes on journeys across seas that can swallow ships without warning. The empire appears invincible from a distance, but for those living within it, life is rarely certain. Every Roman understands, in some quiet corner of their mind, that the grandeur surrounding them, temples, amphitheaters, triumphal arches, is built upon a fragile chain of systems. Grain must move, armies must hold the borders, cities must remain calm. If any link weakens, the illusion of permanence begins to crack. And yet in 150 AD, few could imagine the scale of change that the centuries ahead would bring. For now, the empire stands at its zenith. Its roads stretch across continents. Its laws bind distant cultures together. Its cities pulse with trade and ambition. But survival inside this immense structure demands constant adaptation. Because in the Roman world, greatness does not erase danger. It only hides it beneath marble, power, and the quiet rhythm of an ordinary morning in Rome. Beyond the city of Rome, the empire stretches outward like a vast web of roads, rivers, and fortified frontiers. What appears from a distance to be an eternal structure is in truth a complex machine, one that must be maintained constantly. If it is to function at all, Survival within the Roman Empire depends not only on strength, but on coordination across thousands of miles. Every stone road laid across mountains, every garrison posted along a frontier, every grain ship crossing, the sea is part of a fragile system, holding the empire together. In 150 AD, this system is still working, but it requires enormous effort. Across the northern edges of the empire runs one of the most formidable defensive lines ever constructed, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching across the rugged landscapes of Britannia, the wall is less a barrier than a warning, a signal to the tribes beyond that Roman order ends here. Behind its stone towers and wooden gates, soldiers endure long winters of wind and rain. Their duty is not conquest, but vigilance. Raids from beyond the frontier are unpredictable, and the distance from Rome makes reinforcements slow. A soldier stationed here may never see the capital whose authority he represents. Farther east, along the broad currents of the Danube River, a similar tension exists. Roman forts watch the forests beyond the frontier, where tribal confederations gather strength and observe the empire's movements. These borderlands are places of uneasy peace.
Trade occurs.
Alliances form, but beneath the surface lies a constant possibility of conflict. To survive in these regions is to live in a state of readiness. Yet the empire's challenges are not limited to its borders. Inside its cities, a different pressure builds, one born from sheer scale. The Roman world contains hundreds of urban centers, each dependent on trade routes, tax collection, and imperial administration. In Alexandria, scholars debate philosophy while dock workers unload grain destined for Rome. In Antioch, merchants negotiate deals that will ripple across the eastern Mediterranean. In Carthage, fertile farmland feeds not only local populations but distant provinces. All of it must function in harmony. If roads deteriorate, trade slows. If governors grow corrupt, taxes fail to reach the imperial treasury. If unrest spreads in a province, the response must be swift enough to prevent rebellion from spreading. The emperor himself, during this era represented by the philosopher-ruler, Antoninus Pius, governs an empire that rarely allows rest. Letters travel for weeks across imperial roads. Reports from distant provinces describe everything from minor disputes to potential uprisings. Each message carries a quiet question. Will the system hold? For now it does. Roman engineering has created infrastructure. Unlike anything the ancient world has seen, aqueducts carry fresh water into crowded cities. Sewers remove waste from beneath the streets. Ports and harbors channel trade across the Mediterranean. Yet these achievements also create dependency. A city that relies on imported grain cannot survive if those imports stop. A province that depends on Roman protection becomes vulnerable if legions are redeployed elsewhere. In other words, the more connected the empire becomes, the more fragile its balance grows. And the ordinary Roman feels this reality in subtle ways. A failed harvest can raise bread prices overnight. A military campaign may require new taxes. A distant rebellion can send waves of uncertainty through markets and households alike. Most people will never meet the emperor, never walk the halls of the imperial palace, never see the full scale of the empire whose laws govern their lives. But they live within its consequences. For farmers in rural Italy, survival depends on land that has been cultivated for generations. For merchants sailing the Mediterranean, survival depends on winds and contracts that can change without warning. For soldiers guarding remote frontiers, survival depends on discipline and loyalty. The Roman world runs on an immense network of human effort. Yet even the most powerful system can be strained. Storms can delay grain fleets. Frontier conflicts can demand new armies. Disease can spread silently through crowded streets. In 150 AD, the empire still appears strong, prosperous, and stable. But beneath the surface, pressures are beginning to accumulate, slowly, quietly, and often far from the marble monuments of Rome. Because in a world this vast, survival is never just a matter of strength. It is a matter of balance. And balance in history rarely lasts forever. For much of the 2nd century, the Roman Empire appears to exist in a rare moment of equilibrium. Its borders hold. Trade flows across the Mediterranean Sea with remarkable regularity. Roads carry messages, armies, and merchants between cities that share little in language or tradition, yet all function within the same imperial framework. To those living in 150 AD, the empire can seem almost permanent, but permanence in human systems is often an illusion created by stability that has simply lasted longer than expected. Beneath the calm surface of Roman prosperity, the forces that shape survival are already shifting. One of the most immediate pressures is demographic. The cities of the empire, especially Rome, have grown to enormous scale. Crowded neighborhoods rise upward in fragile towers of brick and timber. Streets are narrow. Water is plentiful thanks to aqueducts, yet sanitation remains imperfect. In such conditions, disease moves quietly. A fever in one household becomes an illness in the next. A crowded market becomes a corridor through which infection can spread unnoticed. In an empire where merchants and soldiers travel constantly between provinces, illness rarely remains isolated. The Roman world is deeply connected, and connection carries consequences. Meanwhile, the empire's frontiers remain tense. Along the northern boundaries beyond the Danube River and the Rhine River, tribal groups observe Roman power with careful patience. They trade with the empire, serve as mercenaries within its armies, and sometimes settle within its lands, but they also learn from it. They study Roman weapons, Roman tactics, Roman weaknesses. At times, they unite in larger confederations capable of challenging the imperial frontier in ways smaller tribes never could. The Roman military remains formidable. Its legions are disciplined, experienced, and supported by an infrastructure that allows armies to move with astonishing efficiency. Yet maintaining this military machine demands resources, taxes, recruits, equipment, and food. As the empire grows wealthier, its expectations grow as well. More soldiers must be paid. More roads must be repaired. More cities require protection. Each additional obligation places weight upon the administrative system that governs the provinces. And then there is the question of leadership. In 150 AD, the empire is ruled by Antoninus Pius, a cautious and deliberate emperor whose reign is marked by relative peace. His governance represents the continuation of a period historians will later call the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of comparative stability within the Roman world. But this stability depends heavily on the quality of imperial succession. When an emperor dies, power must pass smoothly to the next ruler. If succession becomes uncertain, if rival claimants emerge or armies choose different leaders, the empire can fracture with alarming speed. History has already shown how quickly Rome can descend into chaos when authority is contested. Civil war is never far from memory. At the same time, the empire's economy is becoming increasingly complex. Vast estates dominate agricultural production in many regions, while smaller farmers struggle to compete. Wealth concentrates in the hands of elites who invest in land, trade, and political influence. For some Romans, prosperity grows. For others, survival becomes more precarious. The imbalance is rarely visible in the grand architecture of the cities. Temples still rise. Amphitheaters still host spectacles. Marble statues celebrate emperors and victories. Yet beneath these monuments, ordinary people continue to navigate the quiet realities of imperial life, rising prices, uncertain harvests demanding taxes, and the ever-present need to endure. This is the paradox of Rome at its height. The empire is powerful enough to dominate continents, yet delicate enough that small disruptions, crop failures, epidemics, political instability can send tremors across its vast territory, and history rarely warns when those tremors will begin. Within a generation, the Roman world will face challenges unlike any it has known before. Devastating disease, intensified frontier wars, and the slow erosion of the stability that once seemed permanent. But in 150 AD, the signs are still subtle. Most Romans rise each morning believing the empire will continue as it always has. They walk its roads, trade in its markets, and serve in its armies with quiet confidence that Rome's order will endure. What they cannot yet see is how quickly even the greatest systems can be tested. Because survival in the Roman Empire has never depended solely on power. It has always depended on resilience, and soon that resilience will be pushed to its limits. History rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. More often, it changes slowly through Pressures that accumulate quietly until the structures people rely upon begin to shift. For the Roman Empire, the decades following 150 AD would test the resilience of the imperial system in ways few Romans had ever imagined. The empire that once seemed perfectly balanced would soon confront forces beyond the control of armies and emperors alike. Among the most devastating of these forces was disease. In the late 2nd century, a pandemic later known as the Antonine Plague spread across the Roman world, carried along the same trade routes and military roads that had once symbolized imperial unity. The illness moved relentlessly through cities, camps, and countryside. Some historians believe it may have been smallpox. Whatever its precise nature, the impact was profound. Crowded urban centers proved especially vulnerable. In cities where tens of thousands lived in close quarters, infection spread with frightening speed. Soldiers returning from campaigns unknowingly carried the disease across provinces, transforming the empire's greatest strength, its connectivity, into a channel of devastation. Entire communities were weakened. Labor forces shrank. Farms struggled to maintain production. Military units lost experienced veterans, whose knowledge could not easily be replaced. Even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who would rule during this difficult period, faced a world where the certainty of Roman stability had begun to fracture. At the same time, pressure along the empire's frontiers intensified. Tribal confederations beyond the Danube River began testing Roman defenses more aggressively, sensing opportunity in an empire strained by disease and economic disruption. The conflicts that followed, known collectively as the Marcomannic Wars, forced Rome to commit enormous military resources simply to maintain its borders. Legions marched north through harsh winters. Supplies were diverted. New taxes were demanded. The empire survived these challenges, but survival came at a cost. The delicate balance that had defined the earlier Pax Romana, stable leadership, reliable trade, confident expansion, was gradually replaced by something more fragile. Political uncertainty increased. Economic disparities widened. Provinces that had once flourished now struggled to recover from repeated crises. For ordinary people, survival required constant adaptation. Farmers rebuilt after lost harvests. Merchants adjusted trade routes to avoid unstable regions. Soldiers learned to fight enemies who had studied Roman tactics and adapted to them. The empire did not disappear. It endured. That endurance, perhaps more than its monuments or conquests, reveals the true nature of Roman survival. Empires are not sustained by marble temples or triumphal arches alone. They persist through millions of individual decisions made by people, navigating uncertain circumstances. A farmer choosing to plant again after a poor season. A soldier holding his position along a freezing frontier. A merchant risking another voyage across unpredictable seas. These quiet acts of persistence form the unseen foundation beneath the grand narrative of empire. Centuries later, historians would look back on Rome and see both its extraordinary achievements and its vulnerabilities. They would study the roads, the laws, the architecture, and the armies that once connected a vast and diverse world. But the deeper story lies within the people who lived through it. Because to survive the Roman Empire was not simply to exist within a powerful state. It was to live inside a system that demanded resilience at every level of society, where prosperity and danger often walked side by side, and where stability could never be taken for granted. On another morning in Rome, long after 150 AD, the same sounds would echo across the city. Merchants opening their stalls, carts rattling across stone streets, the slow current of the Tiber River moving steadily toward the sea. Empires rise, systems strain, history shifts. But the human instinct to endure, to wake, rebuild, and continue remains one of the most powerful forces in history. And it was that instinct, more than any army or emperor, that allowed the Roman world to survive as long as it did.